It's Don here from the board. Thanks for coming along and checking out this video. So today we're going to be having a look at a custom built keycap case. I like to get very hands-on with my keyboard building. I'm very, I don't know, I like doing things with my hands, and too much of, I suppose, the keyboard scene is just about building keyboards. And I know there's people who make accessories and they make artisans and cool, nifty looking things, but a lot of it's manufactured by factories. And of course, that makes sense because it's in bulk, right? And recently, there was an Australian fellow, Jono, who went out of his way to get something manufactured 100% in Australia or as close to as possible. And it was really inspirational. And part of that, they had a custom case for the keyboard made, for his Kangaroo keyboard. And I was super inspired by it. So I wanted to make a case. Now, you can already buy keycap cases out there, and they're made by various companies like, I think Max Key do them, or JTK cases, and they come in small or medium large, and whole different sizes of key sets and heights and stuff like that. And they're usually in plastic. They're usually in acrylic. Now, I wanted to do something handmade, and I wanted to do it in wood. I love working with wood. Wood is a really lovely material. It has a great look. It can have some really great finishes to it. It's got a really nice feel about it, and not to mention wood is a great carbon capture plant, right? It takes in carbon dioxide from the environment and uses it to do its building blocks. And so having plantations helps with carbon footprints and growing more trees and providing oxygen and all that really good environmental stuff, which, sure, you're going to probably spend a lot of carbon and energy cutting it down, processing it, but hey, at least there's a bit of an offset in some ways. So I set about to make myself a wooden keycap case. And this is just my journey, and we'll get to see what it looks like at the end. So rather than showing you the actual product, I actually took a whole bunch of photos along the way, and let's just step through them, and then we can have a look at the actual end result, which you'll see in the photos anyway. So, here we go. I started off with some timber lengths. I bought them from my local hardware store, Bunnings, and I wanted a certain thickness that I could work with that was going to be quite reasonable, and I chose a 7mm thickness. And using the mini bench saw, which you've already seen from this channel a number of times, I started cutting down some slats. I took some measurements and decided on the actual size that I wanted to work with, and I all drew it into my little, handbook that I use for my designs and so on and so forth. Did some calculations and whatnot. So I started cutting, and I don't think I have any controls for... I'll just use the arrow keys. Okay, so I had to actually change the blade because it was getting worn from my previous stuff, and this is just the inside of stripping apart that saw, and I counted the teeth and worked out the size. It's a 60mm blade with 60 teeth, and the bore size was 8mm, so I could get a replacement. And after doing a whole bunch of rip cuts through the timber that I got, that's how much sawdust was actually inside the motor chamber where it should not have got to. Anyway, different story. So now we're starting to glue, and I didn't have enough clamps, so I had to go out and buy more clamps. And this is one of the foundational pieces. You can see a bit of this weird stuff here. It's because I was using this plastic sheeting, and so that the clamps wouldn't actually get stuck to it, as well as the fact that it was going to keep it flat and in a straight plane, because I don't have a planing device. I don't have a planing tool. And having these bits of plywood as a straightening device, I didn't want the plywood to stick to the actual timber itself. But unfortunately, it actually ripped the print off the plastic with the PVA glue. So you can see that I've glued a third piece, so now it's bigger and it's the final size that I wanted, and that's what a full panel looked like. It's 3 pieces and then I started on the other side of the case. So more gluing, and this was just a test fit. This was a test fit of all the rows to space them out and make sure that it was going to be okay. And this was a height check because I designed it to fit sculpted SA. And so a sculpted row 1 keycap will sit in there with about a mil and a half of clearance, roughly. Okay, I'm pretty happy with the size that I decided to cut, and my cuts were sufficiently accurate to cover for that. So now we're gluing and clamping corners, and that was the base piece. So you can see a bit more of that plastic stuff was getting stuck to it. Not quite straight cuts. You can see the actual curvature of the blade in some spots there. But you know what? I'm an amateur woodworking person with very limited tools. So the rows fit in, and that was just test fitting. And now comes the fun part of actually gluing those rows in. And in order for me to make sure I maintain the right spacing, the gaps for the keycaps, I built this strip. And what I did was I taped some row 3, or they're DSA keycaps, sorry, to the underside, and then I flipped it over so that the actual wood spacer would be in the middle of the position and not accidentally get glued to the bottom of the case. So flip it upside down, and you can butt up one of the actual divider pieces there and glue it in. So there we go. We start gluing, clamps, and look at that. Fits a whole bunch of keycaps. I think it's like 19U. Just some grab bag keycaps to see how it would fit. And it didn't fall out, which was really great. And none of the keycaps tumbled out, which was really great. So at a higher angle just to see how they sit and fit. And now we start gluing and gluing and gluing. So a lot of gluing and waiting, of course, in between each set of gluing so that they wouldn't come out. And then just making sure that they're all flush and gluing down, well, not gluing down, but clamping and applying pressure over the top to try and straighten it out. Now we're gluing some more edges for the lid. And there is the two halves put together. Of course, then we need hardware. So you can see there's a bit of mismatch. Accuracy in cuts and clamping and gluing. Like I said, I'm an amateur, right? It's not perfect, but hey, I can live with it for my first ever attempt of building a box with some very rudimentary tools. So out comes the chisel to clean up and cut away and scrape some excess glue and timber away. Then we sand it down a bit in the bathtub so that it doesn't go everywhere. And the hinges. So you can actually see the lid height is different to the base height, and that was calculated. Just got some cheap brass piano hinges, some short ones, and thankfully they were just thin enough that they weren't going to protrude out the top of the lid. And what do you know? It works. Hinges well, closes up quite neat, fairly straight, and then some front clasps. So once again, just big enough to fit, because you can see it's just on the boundary, just on the thickness of that lid and the actual hinge part of the clasps. Got them in, tapped them in, they open, and voila, test fit with my Akko Tokyo set that I took off my keyboard at work because I put on GMK Firefly. And then I cut up some foam strips because the cherry profile is actually so short. I was concerned that if you were going to be moving it around and flipping it around, that they'd tumble inside, because you can see there's still quite a lot of gaps in some of these areas that they'd be a bit of a mess. So cutting the actual foam strips and putting it in there, it still clips down and fits, and it stops them from tumbling around. What you will also notice is this top row is actually quite wide. It is wider than 1U height, but that was just a miscalculation on my part, really, and I still ran with it because I didn't want to try and cut it down and trim it. But I felt it was actually useful for the purposes of fitting ISO keycaps and unusually sized keycaps, even if it's at an angle, and or if you have a key set and there's a USB cable that actually matches and goes with that key set, that's a perfect space for you to coil it up and store it, so it actually stays together. And of course, it peels up, and there you go. There is the keycaps. So let's actually have a look at it. Let's have a look at it, just so you have a sense of size and scale relative to everything else. And here it is. Here is my homemade, fully self-designed. I didn't take anything off the internet. I sketched it out myself and whacked it together. It took me a number of days to fully put this together, especially with all of the gluing that was required. And you can see, I didn't really get it right. I didn't get it perfect, but, at the same time, I'm actually quite happy and pleased with it. There is a bit of a gap there, but that's mostly, once again, design error than anything else. There's the front with the actual clasps. Not quite matching up there either, so the clamps weren't doing 100% 90 degrees on that. This side matching at the front, not so much at the back, and you can see the joints are not fully straight. It's a little bit wobbly, but overall I am actually really happy with it. I'm really proud that I've taken the time to conceptualize it, to put it together, and it's really nice. It's simple. I could paint this, I could stain it, I could maybe, engrave or etch even a nameplate to go with this. And camera, focus. Okay. Because, if you're going to house an expensive or a nice set inside it, you could have a little nameplate thing with a card that goes in, and it's what that set is. I understand that people have the clear plastic ones because, the plastic ones allow you to see the set, and they're much thinner, smaller, more lightweight, because this is quite hefty, being timber. But at the same time, a timber case, a wood case, adds a level of premiumness to it. It adds prestige to it, right? Had this been made very well by an actual woodworker, by somebody who was an artisan woodworker, you could slap a premium on that if you had a set with it. If you had like a really expensive set or a hard to come by set, and you store it in a case and you bring it out, it adds to that feel, right? It adds to that whole, this is quality, like a nice dark stain. Or if you've done it in hardwood, this is just pine, right? Because me messing around, experimenting, I'm not going to spend a lot of money on expensive timber, especially if it's just me hacking around and having fun with it. So let's just flip it open, right? The front clasps, they both work. And whoop, there you go. The foam does its job. I've still got another strip there that you could put, like a cable into, right? If you really had to, if you really wanted to. Though this one's not really coiled up to be the right length for it. But, you kind of get the idea if it was actually lengthened out, but it's not. And the keycaps live inside. Now, if I was to remake this case, I would certainly have a lot of, whoops, clicked on the wrong button there, accidentally. If I was to redo this, I would possibly make these dividing row sections just a little bit lower, in fact, to be flush with the sides, because you can see that there's a lip here on the lid, right? And that goes down to the sides and sort of adds to that security. But I would actually make that lower, and I would look at perhaps getting a soft foam with, like, I don't know, felt or something, velvet, and put it on the lid. And that way, when you close it, it automatically presses and holds all of your keycaps down regardless of the height, instead of my sort of makeshift solution, which is these individual strips of foam. Because you don't want to have to peel this back, and you don't want to have to lose the actual pieces of foam, and so on and so forth. Whereas if it's actually built into the case, then that would be better, right? So there you have it. There is a handmade, it's made of pine, right? It's affordable. It was probably only, you know, $25 worth of 7mm pine pre-dressed. The hardware was about $8 for the hinges and the clasps. Glue, it's PVA glue, it's relatively negligible. And if you've got the tools like a saw, table saw, bench saw, some clamps, it's just time, right? It's just time, labor. But it's also an experience. So now I have a better understanding of constructing a box and the case and where I went wrong and, you know, cutting tolerances and measurements and all of that kind of stuff. And I actually now have a case for a key set, whereas previously it was just living in a cardboard box. Not that there's anything wrong with key sets living in cardboard boxes, but now, you know, I've got something that I can be like, hey, check this out. What's in the case? There's a key set. So, maybe you enjoyed that, maybe you didn't. Maybe it inspires you to get into the workshop and make a case out of timber if you've got some. If you are into keyboards and woodworking and you've got the tools and resources, if you want to produce some and put them on the market. I definitely would not sell this because I honestly don't know if anybody would want to buy this because of such bad quality. But as far as a proof of concept goes, I think it works. I would say that there are some people who would appreciate a really nice, well-made, maybe hardwood, key set case. Hey, you could go all out with this. You could even have a window section with glass in it and whatnot. Like, you could put a handle on it. You could have a leather satchel that it sits inside that, you know, has a buckle that does it up. There's all sorts of things that you can play with in this space to add that touch of premium and that class to keep your keycaps safe. Alright, well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that journey. I actually did have a really great time putting this together. I love doing this kind of stuff and, you know, pushing the limits on what some cheap, simple tools can do. And, yeah, making something is, with your hands, having a final thing, seeing it come together is just one of the best things you can ever do. Right, that's it. Usual end of video spiel, like button, comments below, subscribe button, bell button, you know the drill. I am off to go. Whoa, my computer just lagged and my head was just all jiggling around everywhere in the video. Getting old. Anyway, thank you for checking out this video, and of course, as usual, until next time, happy clacking.